Welcome to the Stronger Than Steel podcast with your host, Austin Davidson and John Keir, talking Steelers all the time. Now, here's Austin and John.
Hello again, and welcome back to another edition of the Stronger Than Steel podcast. My name is John Keir. Today on a solo episode. Finally back on today's show. Trying to get caught up in terms of looking at draft prospects. Austin has been working double time, getting work done. It has been pumping out the episodes, and I've been a little busy lately, but I'm getting back in the flow of things here and hoping to get a good chunk of these posted over the next few days and get caught up here. As Austin and I come down for the home stretch of this pre-draft process and we start looking at the final positions before we do hopefully a mock draft and get ready for draft day, which is just over 2 weeks away. So first things first today, talking about cornerbacks, and that's appropriate because it's a position that has undergone a bunch of changes for the Pittsburgh Steelers over the past couple months. One of the deeper cornerback rooms in the NFL last season, the Steelers had arguably four starting caliber players in the cornerback room, most notably Joe Hayden and Steven Nelson, and in the slot they had both Mike Hilton and Cameron Sutton. There was a lot talked about with Sutton and Hilton, who were both entering the final years of their contracts, and as we know, now that they were free agents, Cameron Sutton was re-signed on a relatively team-friendly deal for the next 2 years with voidable years following that deal. And Mike Hilton signed elsewhere with the Cincinnati Bengals. None of that was too surprising. I think Mike Hilton probably got a little less money than was originally anticipated, but with the way the market kind of developed and the way teams were being a little more careful to hold on to their money with the losses and revenue from 2019 to 2020, and you add into the fact that a lot of teams were facing a salary cap crunch like the Steelers themselves, and you see a lot of players getting probably not as much money as you might expect, but still Hilton getting good money with the Cincinnati Bengals. That opened up a hole for the Pittsburgh Steelers at cornerback, but luckily there was a player in Cameron Sutton who, now being re-signed, should be able to step into that role as a slot cornerback, and was expected to be able to fill that hole nicely, even if they are different players, Hilton and Sutton, that is. But what was surprising was a few weeks ago when we learned that the Steelers and Steven Nelson appeared to be heading towards a breakup of sorts. First, news came out that the Steelers had allowed Steven Nelson to seek permission for a trade. There's been a lot discussed about what ultimately happened, but as far as I understand it, Nelson was wanting a contract extension. He felt that he had outperformed his current deal, which by all accounts over the last 2 seasons in Pittsburgh, he had done just that and was worthy of earning a new contract. The Steelers did not necessarily agree with that. In fact, they probably were more likely to ask for a pay cut, seeing as how they view fellow cornerback Joe Hayden as the top cornerback in the room. And when Nelson asked for a new deal, the Steelers, rather than at that point you're not going to ask him to take a pay cut, and rather than just simply keeping him on for one last season, they asked him to seek a trade, and as was the case at the time, he was unable to find a trade partner, so the Steelers decided to release him outright. And a lot has been written and said about this. I won't spend a ton of time on it, but what I will say is I don't agree with the philosophy of removing one of your better players on the defense, specifically a defensive positional group that the Steelers have had so much trouble drafting and developing on over the years. In a win-now mode, this is supposed to be the last ride with Ben Roethlisberger, deciding to willfully make your team worse by getting rid of a player of Nelson's caliber given all your struggles to replace and add cornerbacks of quality in the draft, I found it to be a pretty questionable personnel decision by the Steelers. I did not agree with it, and while I understand maybe allowing him to try to seek a trade, I don't know why the Steelers felt it necessary to not keep Steven Nelson. It's been written before in an article on SteelersDepot.com that not signing lineman Joe Haig, not signing defensive lineman Chris Wormley, and I believe restructuring, or it wasn't a restructure. It was the restructuring of Stephon Tuitt and Chris Boswell, which is going to be coming anyways later in the offseason. Doing all that would save the Steelers the same amount of money that cutting Steven Nelson would have. And I know that those depth pieces are nice, but I'd rather have Steven Nelson personally, and I think a lot of people would too. So, that being the case, the Steelers' cornerback depth has been significantly damaged. Not just by the loss of Mike Hilton, but also now by the loss of Steven Nelson, who is still a free agent. So, with that being the case, let's take a brief look at the cornerback room. The returning starters, Joe Hayden and Cameron Sutton, are now slotted to be your starting outside cornerbacks. It's been said that Sutton is going to move into the slot and nickel and sub-package situations, which means that extra outside cornerback position is going to be left between the likes of the four other cornerbacks on the roster, being a former third-round pick Justin Lane, a undrafted free agent from last year James Pierre, an NFL veteran Trevor Williams, who's bounced around on practice squads before, and Steven Denmark, a younger player that has also bounced around the league as well. So, you look at that list, there's not a ton of promising names, which means that unless the Steelers add a low-level free agent after the draft, they're probably going to end up drafting a player to help out at cornerback, because you're banking a lot on an undrafted free agent or other unproven guys like Justin Lane, who has not shown much throughout his current stint with the Steelers. Add into the fact that Joe Hayden is likely in his final season with the Steelers. This is a position group that could easily be addressed by the Steelers in the draft, and I think that would make a lot of sense. So, with that in mind, Austin and I both looked at 10 different cornerback prospects, and he already covered his. So I will be starting with the guys I looked at. And I'll run a list of them real quick. Starting with Ahsante Samuel Jr. from Florida State, Sean Wade from Ohio State, Fetu Melifanu from Syracuse, Robert Rochelle from Central Arkansas, and Keith Taylor from Washington. So, trying to do something a little different this time. You know, I'm not a professional scout. I'm not a professional analyst. I feel like I understand what I'm looking at, and I try to watch as much tape as I can on these guys as time will allow me to. And I think I can come to my own conclusions based on what I've seen and other reports that others have said. So you can get this information on a lot of places. So I, rather than just reading off a bunch of things, I think I'm going to try something a little different here, where I get my thoughts and opinions on the player out, and then I try to answer some general questions about them and how they might fit in with the team, and sort of what their best and worst attributes are and why. So, with that in mind, first I'm going to talk about Florida State cornerback Ahsante Samuel Jr., the son of Asante Samuel Sr., obviously, the former NFL Pro Bowl cornerback with the Eagles and Patriots. Samuel Jr. is built very much in the same mold of his dad, at 5'10", 184 pounds. Keep an eye on this name. This is a guy that Mike Tomlin spoke to at the Florida State Pro Day, and there's apparently some interest between these two sides. And if he's available at 24, it seems at this point that there's a chance he could be taken. So, Samuel Jr., like Samuel Sr., is a smaller but relatively athletic cornerback. As we already know, with his father being Samuel Sr., Jr. had a lot of good coaching at home. He was part of a state championship team as a sophomore and junior in high school. Was a former All Florida player in high school. Something kind of interesting, he blocked 4 kicks as a senior in high school. And then once he got to the NFL, he played sparingly his freshman year, but did have 3 starts and led the team, and most of all, ACC freshman in pass breakups his freshman year. Then became a full-time starter in his second season, racking up 3rd team All-ACC honors with 14 pass breakups and an interception. Only played in 8 games, started all 8 of them. As a junior, was first team All-ACC, and then, this was last year. Sorry, my apologies. And he had 6 pass breakups, but he was the first team All-ACC and the first Florida State player since 2000 with 3 interceptions and 2 fumble recoveries in the same season. So, when it comes to things that I thought really stuck out to me when I was thinking about what I saw from Asante Samuel is that, number one, the reason he's not going to be the top cornerback off the board is simply because of his size. And size isn't everything at the NFL, we know that. But, I mean, you think about Ahsante Samuel, think about the guys that he's going to have to go up against. Think about Troy Hill, for instance, from the Los Angeles Rams. He's not a big guy, he's not the most overly athletic guy. So the Rams would never have him lined up on DK Metcalf one-on-one because he just doesn't have any chance. So you're going to have some matchup issues with Samuel Jr. if you don't get him on the right guy. So that's something to keep in mind. But beyond that, there's a lot of good things to like. He reads the game very well, plays fast, is athletic, not super athletic, but because he reads and plays the game so fast, it makes him look faster than he actually is. He's got good ball skills, and I thought he was overall a really solid player. The biggest problem, though, is that his size is working against him, but his biggest strength is that he's got, a former NFL father, so he's got good bloodlines, and he plays like a guy who's been A, coached up, and B, it's in his family, it's in his blood. So, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else here that I might have missed when talking about. Yeah, so I really liked what I saw from Samuel Jr. as far as his ball skills go. He only had 4 interceptions, which isn't a ton, but he did break up a ton of passes. And it wasn't just he broke up a pass as it got there. He would also, the pass would be caught and then he'd rip it away from the receiver's hands. So it's not just, he's deflecting it away. It's he's ripping the ball out when it should have been caught. So that was impressive to see. And like I said, he just reads the game so well. He can break on the pass on a route before the receiver is even out of his breaks. I mean, this guy, he knows what's going on, and that's really helpful to have in an NFL defense because they can be opportunistic, they can take chances. I mean, we saw that from William Gay. William Gay, big play Willie Gay, he had 4 pick sixes in his NFL career. He was never the fastest cornerback on the field, but as he grew older, as he understood the game better, he made more plays, he made more big plays because he saw what was going on in front of him. This is an advanced trait for a young player to have, and I think that I think that's a great skill to have, and it sets him apart from a lot of the other young cornerbacks you see in the NFL. So that makes him a coveted prospect. And as I said, the reason why he's probably going to be available late in the first round is because of that size. And because of his size, number one, he's not the best player when it comes to his run support. He's not up to par, but that's not really unsurprising. I know Mike Hilton was a great run defender, but that doesn't mean every player that size is going to be. In fact, Hilton is more of the outlier in that sense. You're going to need Samuel Jr. to beef up a little bit and just work on making sure he tackles the catch and doesn't allow big plays, because there's going to be times where he's matched up against those bigger receivers and tight ends on occasion. Just make sure you get those guys on the ground, and when the opportunity presents itself, come with a big hit, but don't only do that like we've seen a lot of players in today's NFL do, and in the college game, and it just gets them burned. So now, in terms of questions to answer, on the talent to production scale. So, real quickly, when you're looking at a player and trying to project him to the NFL level, there is always a mix of what talent did he show in college, A, how consistently did he do it, and how much production did he have in college, and how consistent was he with that. So on a scale from Jarvis Jones, who was all production and not as much talent, to a guy like, I don't know, would be a good example for that. How about, Chase Claypool didn't have bad stats. That might not be the best sort of example, but I'll have to come back to you on that. But the point is someone that's a toolsy player that didn't necessarily have a ton of statistics. I guess maybe Jadeveon Clowney would be a good example of that. That's kind of extreme because he was a number 1 overall pick, but my point is that Clowney was never a big producer in college. He was mostly known for just a few big plays, and the talent was evident on tape right away. That guy was just built different, So I guess on a scale from Jadeveon Clowney to Jarvis Jones in terms of talent but not much production consistency to a lot of production consistency from Jarvis Jones but not much talent, where would a guy like Samuel Jr. fall? And I think it's pretty close to right in the middle, but leaning towards production. There's talent there. If you're small like this, you have to be talented. And Samuel Jr. is a athletic player. Again, not overly athletic, not dominant in any real areas besides his zone coverage, I thought. Just a guy that can, sort of like a jack of all trades, can do a lot of things pretty well. There's a couple weaknesses to his game. He's not elite really in any areas, but he checks a lot of boxes. And he produced a good amount in college, so on that graph he'd actually be pretty good in both areas. But again, not really elite in either. His ceiling? What is Samuel Jr.'s ceiling? I think he's could be a long-time starter at the NFL level. Maybe a starter for maybe up to 10 years. If he stays healthy, doesn't get beat up physically, he can be a really good cornerback. Maybe not a dominant cornerback, but a solid starter for a number of years. I'll be interested to see where the NFL is in terms of its athletes in the next 10 years. Do the smaller slot-style cornerbacks start to disappear? Do they do something else? We'll see. But I think he's got a good future as a solid, good starter, maybe a couple Pro Bowls in there. And his floor, honestly, I think the floor is pretty high. I remember Austin talking about Patrick Surtain Jr. and how he wasn't necessarily elite in any area, but his floor was so high. And I feel pretty similarly with Samuel Jr., the one issue being his size. So perhaps he's limited to a zone-heavy scheme, and a lot of teams you have to be able to do both now. So maybe he's only a rotational cornerback at worst for 5 or 6 years. I think that's kind of the worst-case scenario. There's a lot to like about Samuel Jr. He's a projected late first, early second-round pick. He's in play at 24. Given the Steelers' current issues at cornerback, I wouldn't hate it. He could play inside or outside, but he mostly was an outside corner. But, I really, the Steelers love their bloodlines, and I would trust it. The size is a concern, but I would feel good about a guy like Ahsante Samuel Jr. in the first round. Moving on to cornerback number 2, Shaun Wade, a 6'1" redshirt junior out of Ohio State. This guy was big time early on. A former 5-star prospect in high school, was named the defensive back of the year at the Army All-American Bowl, and had 7 interceptions as a senior in high school. His first 2 seasons at Columbus were huge, especially his second season. He was first team All Big Ten, starting as a slot cornerback with 9 starts. He was just a machine out there. And then last season, he originally opted out and then decided to come back. Ohio State moved him to the outside, and he really didn't play as well his final season as he did the previous 2 seasons. Still finished with some decent stats, had 2 interceptions and a touchdown, but the consensus was his final season at Ohio State did not match the production, or rather the skill, that he had in his first 2 seasons. So I can tell you that from the tape I saw, his tape in 2019 was much better than his tape in 2020. Who knows why he struggled so much in 2020? Obviously, he's playing a different cornerback position outside versus the slot. Those are 2 totally different worlds. A. B. He had originally chosen not to play. So after deciding to play, did he make that decision too late? Had it already been a case where he was not properly trained and in shape? Did he get off to a slow start, and by the time he was up to speed, his confidence had been shaken? Who knows? I'm not an Ohio State reporter, so I can't say for certain. But he still showed some good things last season. But like I said, comparatively, he just was not the same player last year that he had been previously. So right now, actually, let me back up. Last year, going into the draft last year, he was seen as probably one of the top 3 or 4 cornerbacks to come off the board in this year's draft before the season. Now, after the season this year, he had dropped to kind of a day 2 selection, like an early day 2 projection, and now he's dropping even further beyond that, where they're talking about him being a late day 2, even an early day 3 pick. So he has fallen quite far and may continue to fall in the weeks leading up to the draft here. And I think a lot of those issues stem from, number one, his struggles on the outside. And whether or not you think that that's a permanent issue, the fact that he struggled on the outside is concerning. You usually don't draft cornerbacks to be just slot cornerbacks early on. If you're drafting slot cornerbacks, they're being drafted later because they are more limited in what they can do. So, that being the case, a team that takes him is going to have to take him knowing that there's a good chance that he won't be able to transition to the outside, which is frustrating because he has the body type to be able to succeed out there. But one of his bigger issues beyond that is his hips. Not having fluid hips, making transitions harder. He's struggled to get on his horse, turn around, and start running with other players. Footwork isn't very good. So guys that are speedy on the outside gave him lots of troubles. I'm blanking on the receiver from Penn State. He absolutely cooked him all game long this past season. So he can get into trouble, especially when tracking the ball too. He can get himself caught up over his own feet. So some disturbing trends coming to the forefront last season. And last but not least, he's not a good run defender. When he wants to be, he can be effective with his frame. But last year he seemed kind of disinterested in stopping the run. I can understand that being on a team like Ohio State, there's a lot of talented players, a lot of other guys who can make those plays, and cornerbacks usually aren't the most active run defenders. But I could tell that he just was not off in another world, but just didn't really want to assist in it unless if he felt like he had to. So, effort issue, in my opinion. That's not going to go over well for teams. So, again, that there is potential here, but when you have a guy that struggles after succeeding for 2 seasons, you want to know why. There's a number of reasons, but those are the 2 or 3 biggest issues. His strengths, though, as a guy who's played a lot over the last 3 years, he has pretty good instincts. He can break on the ball pretty well. I thought that he did a good job, especially in the Indiana game where he had his pick six. It was kind of thrown to him, but he was in perfect position, and when he's in zone coverage, he does a good job of putting himself in position to either make plays or close down on gaps really quickly. And his ball skills were pretty good, as I mentioned to before. He can fight in the air with the receiver for the ball with the best of them. He had a solid number of college interceptions and pass breakups too. So I thought that was a pretty defining trait for him and something that stood out for me. Talent to production scale. Wow, this would have been different a year ago, but right now the production just fell off comparatively. The talent is there. Again, I don't know if he's just a slot corner or if he's an outside corner, but if he sets his mind to it, he could be a pretty darn good slot corner. I just don't know if teams are going to be looking for a slot-only cornerback this early. It's possible a team will take a chance on him, hoping that he can make that transition to the outside, that maybe it was just a fluky year, and maybe it was. So I can't say for certain right now, but I do have my concerns, and I imagine other NFL teams will. His ceiling is that he will be able to transition to the outside. He will be able to play in the slot. I don't know that he will, but that is his ceiling. He'll be able to do both, and he'll be able to do both effectively as a zone cornerback mostly, but can also play man and should be able to come down with a good amount of interceptions. I don't think he'll ever be more than a 1 or 2 time Pro Bowler at best. I think he might be lucky enough to make one of these days. Worst case scenario is his effort continues to be an issue. He's limited to just the slot, and he's a guy that just plays out his rookie contract. And if he continues to be disinterested, as I saw in his tape last year, he won't even make it through his rookie contract. But I suspect he'll get at least 2 or 3 years in if he doesn't show any real interest. And that's, again, worst case scenario. So that's the ceiling and floor right there. So as I mentioned before, he's being projected as, right now, kind of a late day 2, early day 3 pick, which is a far cry from the first round grade he had last season. I would think that in terms of where he fits, the Steelers need a slot cornerback right now. So if you're talking about adding a slot corner, this is actually not a horrible one to get. And, the Steelers like picking guys from Ohio State. There's a lot of other former Buckeyes on the team. Maybe that would help him get into things again. He's got some things to clean up in his game. I do have concerns about the hips, but even if he is just a slot corner, is that such a bad thing to take a late day 2 pick on? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not the general manager. I think in terms of long-term aspirations, we're not sure if Cameron Sutton's going to re-sign after his current deal. And as we've seen with receivers, maybe it's not a bad idea to draft one every year. So if you don't get a guy in the top 2 rounds, maybe you think about a guy like Shaun Wade in the 3rd or 4th round. I don't think that I'd be mad at that, but I also think it might take a little time for him to transition to the NFL. So bottom line, some concerning plays and tape that I saw have muddied his projection in the NFL draft, but there's still talent here, and if he wants to put in the work, he should be a good player and could still be a really good player as well. Moving on to the 3rd cornerback, Ifeatu Melifonwu from Syracuse. He is a tall, 6'3", 212-pound cornerback, and kind of flew under the radar playing at Syracuse. But he is, as I mentioned, an imposing figure and a pretty darn good cornerback too. He was a multi-positional athlete and first team All-State player in 2016, also played basketball, lacrosse, and ran track in high school. Was a special teams contributor his first season and then became a regular his second season. Tied for the team lead with 10 pass breakups as a sophomore, and then earned second team All-ACC honors last year and was a Senior Bowl invite with 1 interception and 6 pass breakups. So, Melifonwu, kind of a more raw prospect compared to the other cornerbacks I've looked at so far. Number one big strength for him is his general athleticism. He's not the best athlete in this class, but there is a unusually strong athlete for a guy that's this big. He has comparable long speed, Melifonwu does, to some of the other really fast wide receivers in the ACC, and he has good long speed and just raw athleticism that is needed to hold up with receivers in man coverage. And he also has a pretty good burst to converge on targets in front of him, as well as coming downhill to stop running plays. So his athleticism, even though it's not great on the surface, he's not a bad athlete, and for his size, that's pretty impressive. And if he can kind of work with coaching, work on a new strength training program, he might be even better, even faster than he showed that he was in college. Melifonwu is most comfortable in zone coverage. Syracuse ran a lot of zone. Breaks on the ball quickly with a good burst, like I mentioned, and again has long and quick strides that help him close down gaps really quickly. Spent a lot of time looking at the quarterback too, and that can hurt if you're not careful. But with looking at the quarterback so much, Melifonwu has a pretty good idea of what's going on when he gets his eyes back there. So he's a pretty strong zone coverage cornerback. And again, just tying in his acceleration, he's not going to fly off the page as an athlete, but he's good enough to make plays. And even though he's a raw prospect in terms of his actual playmaking ability, the athleticism is somewhere you can start with and move on from there. The biggest issues with him that I saw, number one was his flexibility, versatility that he can offer defense. I've seen it written and said about him that scouts seem to think that he could transition to safety, and while he does have the body type to do that, he did only play a grand total of 3 snaps at the safety position in college, and he only played 16 snaps in the slot. So in terms of general position versatility, unless if you've seen something in Syracuse practice that I haven't, he's offering no versatility. I mean, he's just an outside cornerback, and he stayed mostly on one side throughout his college career. So if you're going to move him around, expect growing pains at the best, and at the worst, it just might not work. So that's something to be aware of. As I mentioned before, he's kind of a raw prospect. There are some things that he does well in terms of reading the quarterback's eyes, but like I said before, he can get caught staring into the backfield. He needs to learn more about the nuances of reading a receiver's footwork, doing a better job of reading receiver options. So there's just a general issue of football IQ at this point, and that will get better in time. But right now it's something that's still a work in progress. And, just other things I wanted to mention is that he is a pretty good tackler. He's not a great tackler. He could be more physical than he is, than his body type should suggest that he is. But again, he's a moldable, raw talent right now that needs to be coached up. And in terms of where he fits on that talent production scale, he did have production, but the floor is lower and the ceiling is higher. I mean, there's real potential for this guy to be a physical force of nature if he can get his technique squared away and he can play a little stronger like his body suggests that he could. There's a lot to like here. But again, the ceiling higher, floor lower with him. Right now, from everything that I've seen about Melifonwu, is that he's a late day 2 selection, and scouts will be surprised if he lasts past the second day. I am disappointed to hear that, just because from a personal standpoint, I like these toolsy guys with a lot of potential. But thinking about how he fits in with the Steelers, we already talked about it. The Steelers struggle mightily to draft and develop cornerbacks. Maybe passing on a guy who's considered a developmental project would be a good idea. But again, a guy that can only play the outside right now is a work in progress. I just think that's something the Steelers can't really afford to do right now. They could. I suppose they could. It all depends on how the draft board kind of presents itself at the time. Late third round and he's available, maybe it's not the worst idea. I just would want for fans and coaches to understand what he is and not have expectations that are too high for him going into the season. So, again, should be a third round pick if he's available late third. That's going to be hard to pass up. Moving on to the fourth cornerback, I'm talking about Robert Rochelle from Central Arkansas. Got a small school prospect here. He's from the same town that Terry Bradshaw went to school, in Shreveport, Louisiana. Totaled over 1,300 scrimmage yards his senior season, was third in the state of Louisiana in the 100-meter dash, so pretty good athlete, as you can tell. Was only a spot starter his freshman season, and then became a full-time starter his sophomore season, and earned All-American honors in his redshirt junior season, was all Southland Conference as well. Led his team with 5 interceptions and had a grand total of 18 pass breakups that season. Last year was again named an All-American and first-team All-Southland Conference, and finished his collegiate career with 10 interceptions and 38 pass breakups. So when talking about Robert Rochelle, let's get the negatives out of the way. Number one, when talking about his size, he's 6'2", 195, but he doesn't play like he's that big. He is not good in terms of run support, and he's a really bad tackler from what I saw. He's got a desire to make plays, but there's not much to like here. He really leans into his tackles, which is just not a way you want to approach tackling, especially not at that size. If you do that in the NFL level, you're going to get hurt, and we saw Ryan Shazier get hurt leaning his head into plays like that. So you got to be careful. Can't be tackling players like that. And beyond that, he's just not packing a punch when he's hitting people. If you're not going to be able to provide power doing that, then you've got to be able to just wrap up, and he can't even do that right now. Hopefully he can get better, but his issues in doing so for this long at the FCS level, that doesn't bode well. He might be a liability in run support and in just general tackling for the rest of his career. Also, there's kind of an obvious downside with him, and it's that he played at the FCS level for Central Arkansas. I know that the gap between the best teams at the FBS level and these FCS teams has kind of narrowed over the years, but still, when you're talking about a guy that is jumping that extra level, you always have to wonder about if he's going to be able to last or if he's going to be able to make that transition. And we've seen a lot of guys that can, but for every guy that does make it from the FCS level, there's 10 guys that don't. So that's something to keep in mind as well. On the plus side, he had a ton of playing time and was a pretty instinctive player, playing in over 40 games and starting 29. He knows what he's reading. He trusts himself and makes good plays on the ball when he gets the opportunity. The statistics back that up. Again, 38 pass breakups is just wild. Was not even a full starter all 4 seasons. and 10 interceptions. For instance, in a game against UAB last season, not even just interceptions, he was able to strip the running back, pick up the ball, and then run it back the other way. In a crowd, mind you. This wasn't just out in the open field one-on-one. It ended up kind of being it wasn't just a one-on-one, like there were people around, other players, but what he was able to do and the speed in which he was able to do it was very impressive. Rochelle is another one of those zone cornerbacks, most comfortable in off coverage, and he made a number of plays on the ball in front of him. Struggled more when he had to turn his back and run with receivers and other targets. Not at his best. Will get a little grabby more often than he should. On the talent to production scale, this one is going to be the opposite of Ifatu Melifanu, a big-time production player in college. There's talent, but not as much, considering that A, he's playing at the FCS level, and B, he still had some warts at the FCS level, which means that they are going to be magnified at the NFL level that much more. Rochelle's ceiling, in my opinion, I think that he could be a pretty good cornerback, could possibly end up starting someday. I don't think that his issues with run defense and tackling are issues that are as big of a deal in today's NFL as they would have been 15 years ago. He needs to get a little more comfortable in man coverage. He can't be just a zone cornerback. I like his potential to be a rotational cornerback somewhere down the line, but again, a project player. It's going to take some time. And of course, the floor for him is he doesn't make an NFL team this year. I see Rochelle projected as a mid to late day 3 pick, and given the jump, and given the fact that there weren't as many games played this year, and the fact that he never really played as dominant as he should have despite his size and speed, I think that makes all things in play possible for him to maybe struggle to make a team out of training camp if he can't get his game better. So, again, 5th, 6th round pick, not a horrible idea to take a flyer on a guy like this, but again, the Steelers' issues here, I think you'd be looking for more production guys here, which would suggest Rochelle, but the transition from FCS to the NFL kind of muddies that a little bit. And finally, the last cornerback I'm talking about tonight is Keith Taylor from Washington, a 6'2", 191-pound senior. Was considered in several outlets a top 32 cornerback in the nation in high school, and was also a standout sprinter in high school as well. Taylor played in 12 games on special teams his freshman year, started 2 games as a sophomore, and then became the full-time starter as a junior, starting 13 games and breaking up 5 passes. Last year he started 4 games and only had 9 tackles. Again, it was only limited action. I could not find out why he wasn't playing at the end of last season. I believe there were some COVID issues, but I think that Washington played more than just 4 games that season. Last year, that is. So, in terms of Taylor's best attributes, probably man coverage. I always felt that Taylor was in really good position. Played a lot of press coverage for a cornerback in college. Physical when running down the field with guys. And even though he's not the fastest cornerback, it didn't matter for other receivers on him because he was so physical with them. They wouldn't be able to get off the line and get down the field because of him. So that's something that you would see. You know, Richard Sherman has made an entire career off of stuff like that. That's not the kind of stuff you see from college cornerbacks. So that's kind of an advanced trait for him to have. Also, he was probably one of, if not the best cornerbacks I looked at in terms of run support. The effort is there. The technique is a bit of a different story, but he does do a good job of providing a pop and flows to the ball pretty well. He just needs to do a better job of learning how to wrap up and making the tackle. The downside, there's one huge downside with Taylor. First of all, I'm going to mention that he has the build of an outside cornerback at the NFL level, and he's got the ability to play the slot. But he's going to make his money in the NFL based on what he can do on the outside. So, not a horrible thing. I think it's just teams need to keep in mind that he's just an outside cornerback. But the number one big issue is ball skills. Now, he finished with a decent number of passes defensed with 10, considering he was only a major starter the last 2 years of his career, and the last year was just 4 games, so it's really like a year and a half, which is not terrible, but he also played in 43 games. He didn't have a single interception. That can't be considered good. I don't care what you're doing. You've got to be able to come away with an interception. And there was instances on tape where a ball floated in his direction that he was unable to put the squeeze on. So you can't convince me that Keith Taylor couldn't have come away with a couple of interceptions in college. Having 0 at an outside corner position is just simply unacceptable. Again, and the even more puzzling thing about it is that he's in good position almost all the time. So the fact that he can't come away with an interception is concerning, and I don't know what it means at the next level. I mean, if he couldn't come away with an interception in college, how is he going to be able to do that in the NFL unless if it's just some sort of freak incident? I mean, I don't know. That's something to keep in mind. But he's a decent athlete. He's physical. He attacks in the running game. Good in man coverage. But again, got to be able to come away with the ball, especially when you're that size too. 6'2", almost 200 pounds. I don't get it. I don't get it. Overall, though, some nice traits to work with. The discernible ball skills, lack of discernible ball skills, that's concerning. Like I said, he's a toolsy and attractive option in the being projected right now in the mid day 3 range. This is another guy where the talent definitely outweighs the production. Like I said, there's traits here, but the production lagging a bit behind in this area. I see Keith Taylor's ceiling as probably a backup cornerback in the NFL. Might be forced to spot start at times. Look, it's hard for me to justify calling a guy a potential long-term starter if he can't come up with the ball. He can rake the ball away as much as he wants, but Ike Taylor did that a lot. He didn't have many interceptions. He was never an elite cornerback, and that's why. Especially in today's NFL, where you give up big plays, it's going to be about, can you make big plays yourself? Can you take the ball away? The Marcus Peters style of playing. And while I don't love it, that's just a fact. And if you can't come away with the ball, it's going to be hard for me to think that you're going to be able to produce and stick around in the league long term, unless if you contribute on special teams. So I think his ceiling is as a number 3 cornerback, most likely, possibly a backup, and then his floor would be as a mid to late third, day 3 pick, out of the league within a year or two. Teams won't give up on him, just like they didn't give up on Brian Allen, but I see a lot of Brian Allen in Keith Taylor, and that's not necessarily a good thing for him. So, that is my discussion point on cornerback prospects, 5 of them, and how they all stack up. So, I'm not going to talk about ranking each one of them, but I will mention my favorite and least favorite. And my favorite was Ahsante Samuel Jr. A pretty good athletic profile, can play in the slot, but spent a lot of time outside, NFL bloodlines. There's a lot to like. The concerns about his size are real and understandable, but still, I think a guy like Samuel, if he's available in the first and the board dictates it, he's not a bad option. He can help the defense right away and can help Cam Sutton take a little bit off his plate, and then you don't necessarily have to rely on James Pierre or Justin Lane to be big-time number 3 cornerback right away. You can help let them be the number 4, and that's a much more comfortable position to be in. Finally, the guy I didn't like as much was Shaun Wade, and I think it's a real shame because his 2020 season, I feel, probably doesn't tell the whole story. He is a guy with potential, but the fact that he just couldn't put it together at all was concerning. And his effort being questioned as well is a huge red flag for me. Rather than go back to Ohio State this year and try to improve, he declared for the draft with his stock plummeting. So, I mean, that's also kind of making me wonder as well. Does he think he can't get any better? Does he think this is as good as it gets? That's concerning for a team to think about. If he is available in the late 4th or 5th round, I'd take a flyer on him because of his physical attributes, but it's hard to envision him working out with the Steelers' history at this time. Hopefully 2020 was just an outlier for him, but again, I have my concerns. So, that wraps up today's podcast, talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers cornerback room and some cornerback prospects ahead of this year's draft. I'll be back talking about offensive tackle prospects next time. Thank you for joining me today on the show. If you have any questions about the Stronger Than Steel podcast, you like what you hear, do you have any suggestions on how we could get better, feel free to email us at strongerthansteelpodcast@gmail.com. Check out our website, strongerthansteelnfl.blogspot.com, and you can check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We appreciate any support and feedback that you could offer us. So thanks again for joining, and until next time, thank you for listening to the Stronger Than Steel podcast.
You have been listening to Stronger Than Steel podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and don't forget to check out our website listed in the description below.